Over the last year or so, I've been delving into the wide world of science fiction, and in particular exploring indie games from every corner of the sci-fi genre. You might be wondering what exactly makes a work science fiction. The simple answer is that every sci-fi story is about technology or scientific developments that don't, or don't yet, exist in the real world. The more complicated answer is that no one agrees on an exact definition, although endless definitions have been offered that variously emphasize human imagination about the future, the consequences and unintended side effects of technological change, and science fiction as a mirror that offers up social commentary on our own times. I personally like this quote from author Norman Spinrad, who said, "Science fiction is anything published as science fiction." Sometimes sci-fi stories are 5 minutes into the future, concerning a single technological development in a world that closely resembles our own. Other times, sci-fi is set in the distant future, on alien worlds, or in other settings completely foreign to our experience. You will sometimes see a distinction drawn between hard science fiction, which is ostensibly constrained by real-world scientific possibilities, and soft science fiction, which is more imaginative, fantastical, and takes liberties with the known limits of science. But for our purposes, all of the above are acceptable. The second thing you might be wondering is just how large the Venn diagram of science fiction and indie games is anyway. And the answer to that is really big. Combining those tags on Steam alone yields almost 8,000 games, and that is far from exhaustive. This is a really popular genre, and there is pretty much every type of sci-fi game you could imagine. There's space operas and simulated realities, cyberpunk revenge stories, off-world colonies and alien invasions multiplied by action platformers and turn-based tactics games, first-person shooters, walking simulators, and open worlds. This isn't a ranking or a countdown or anything, it's just a list of 50 sci-fi games that I think are pretty cool. So if your favorite didn't make the list, it's possible I haven't played it, didn't connect with it, or that it just didn't make this particular list. But you should absolutely weigh in and recommend your favorite sci-fi indies in the comments. I'm hoping this video can be a continuing source of recommendations for anyone interested in science fiction, and I threw in a bunch of honorable mentions with that in mind. I also tried to cover a wide variety of games that represent the incredible diversity and range of sci-fi stories. Speaking of which, I decided to group these games by sci-fi subgenre, rather than by gameplay mechanics, so this list is divided into 8 broad categories, which you can discover for yourself by watching the video, or by checking the video description if you'd rather skip straight to something that interests you. There's obviously a fair amount of genre overlap. You know, some games about space travel also deal with artificial intelligence or survival horror or what have you, so take these genres with a grain of salt. That said, I put a lot of thought into these categories, and I think I've encompassed most of our favorite sci-fi genres. You can let me know what you think. I do think that genres and subgenres tend to crystallize over time. As with fantasy, westerns, or mysteries, our understanding of science fiction is shaped by the media it produces, in such a way that the lines between parody, homage, and simply being a sci-fi story have become impossibly blurred. There's a reason that space knights wield laser swords, ships go to warp speed, and technological dystopias look a lot like Kowloon Walled City. Popular works have always helped define the genres they represent, and it's neat to see video games further that tradition. A couple quick caveats to head off some potential comments. First, no comic book superhero stuff, even though it kind of just is science fiction. I mean, Superman is an alien, Spider-Man is bitten by a mutant science experiment, and Iron Man builds crazy nanotech gadgetry, so it's definitely fi about sci, but the whole comic book genre feels like its own thing, you know? Second, no zombie games. Are zombies sci-fi? The answer is probably sometimes, but I don't think zombies are inherently a science fiction concept, so I'm not including anything just because it has zombies. Also, no steampunk. There's an argument to be made that steampunk is just science fiction from the perspective of some point in the past, and stuff like Jules Verne that feels very steampunky now was most definitely the legitimate science fiction of its day, but it doesn't feel like sci-fi to me, a person living in the actual 21st century. So you won't see any of the SteamWorld games here, even though they are pretty good. This took a long time to put together, like a really long time. So if this is the kind of thing you appreciate, let me know in the comments. Plus, like and subscribe to keep this channel growing. It really does make a difference. But without any further ado, let's kick things off and tackle our first sci-fi subgenre. The final frontier: space, space exploration, and space combat. When I think about science fiction, the first thing that comes to my mind is space. Star Trek, Star Wars, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Interstellar have invaded the public consciousness and no doubt provided inspiration for many of the games on this list. Many early video games were, in fact, space games, like Space War, Asteroids, Space Invaders, or Galaxian. And of course, the space race and the moon landing were massive contributing factors to the overall popularity of modern science fiction.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Space is the next, and according to Trekkies, last frontier to invite human exploration. An uncharted sea of stars and worlds and possibilities so vast the nearest exoplanet is a literal lifetime away from our pale blue dot. Games about space tell an incredibly wide range of stories and feature a host of diverse gameplay elements. In games with a hard sci-fi grounding, space tends to be a hostile ocean of unknown dangers that must be navigated, catalogued, and conquered. For more fantastical games, space is a vehicle to tell sweeping, imaginative stories about alien races, intergalactic trade, politics, or warfare, and life among the stars. What holds true for all space games is that planet Earth seems a tinier part of the universe than ever before. First up, and once again in no particular order, is J.U.L.I.A, Among the Stars. J.U.L.I.A Among the Stars is a 2014 update/remake of J.U.L.I.A, an interplanetary point-and-click adventure in the far-flung reaches of space. 400 years in the future, an expedition of Earth scientists and soldiers have reached a distant solar system in hopes of finding a suitable replacement for Earth. The game begins when astrobiologist Rachel Manners is awoken from cryogenic sleep by the ship's AI, J.U.L.I.A, only to discover that she is the only remaining member of the expedition aboard the ship. The rest of the crew woke from cryosleep 60 years earlier and began colonizing the solar system, but have since lost contact with the ship, leaving their fates unknown, which is already a great premise for a mystery sci-fi adventure. Along with J.U.L.I.A and a surface exploration robot called Mobot, Rachel investigates the nearby planets, slowly unravels several parallel story threads, and discovers the fates of the crew. All the planets are really different from one another, and they all offer different kinds of puzzles and mysteries, which is cool. This is a game with a lot of reading, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of aha moments, many of which are a bit horrifying. Overall, I'm pretty neutral on point-and-click games, as I tend to enjoy the mystery and story elements, but sometimes find all the pointing and clicking a bit tedious and obtuse. However, J.U.L.I.A avoids anything too frustrating, and the story, I think, has some interesting takes on humanity, AI, and first contact. The idea of waking up and realizing that everyone you know has been living their lives for 60 years is an intriguing setup, and I thought the mystery did some fun stuff with that concept. Nova Drift. Nova Drift is a modern version of Asteroids, with some light roguelike elements, crazy neon particle effects, and a really satisfying gameplay loop. It's a point-and-click space shooter about fending off endless waves of enemy spacecraft, black holes, and, of course, asteroids. As you blast enemy ships to smithereens, you accumulate experience points, which can be spent on a huge variety of ship upgrades that radically change your playstyle. You can, for instance, melt enemies with radiant fire shields, zip around the screen at hypersonic speeds, or store up massive volleys of homing lasers. The upgrades keep coming at a pretty good pace, which I like because you can dive into a new playstyle pretty quickly each run. Overall progress adds new upgrades to the pool, and you can keep pushing as far as you can until you're inevitably overrun by swarms of enemy spacecraft and have to start over. I like the simple joy of activating thrusters with one click and blasting enemies with the other, and I really like flanking enemies or escaping a jam with screen wrap. I actually always like screen wrap wherever it appears. I think it's very fun and silly, and I love using it. Anyway, Nova Drift is some good mindless fun with a cool space aesthetic, and a whole bunch of bonus modes if you want to crank up the difficulty or the chaos. I've definitely whiled away a few hours with this one, and if you enjoy some good arcade-style gameplay, you can too. FTL, Faster Than Light. FTL is one of my all-time favorite games, and one of the most tense and tactical space adventures on offer. It's basically Oregon Trail in space with real-time tactical Star Trek combat and endless ways to configure your ship. Your mission is to jump from point to point across an 8-sector galaxy, with the rebel fleet hot on your tail, navigating random events, enemy encounters, and interstellar hazards, while frantically managing your ragtag crew and scraping together enough scrap to upgrade your shields, reactor, or weapons system. The best part of the game is building a killer new spaceship each run, and the possibilities are near endless. I personally like to keep it simple and overwhelm opponents with straight-up firepower, but I've beaten the game using just about every possible method. Assembling the meanest possible Mantis boarding party, burninating enemy ships with fire beams, hacking O2 systems and suffocating the enemy crew, swarming the enemy with attack drones, draining enemy shields with ion pulses and frying their crew with the anti-bio beam, or using stealth and long-range scanners to avoid combat altogether. Just as many times I've been halfway to a great build when my ship was blown up by enemy fire or solar flares, or my last crew member suffocated on his way to shelter in the medbay or repair a hull breach. I've accidentally blown up my own boarding party before they could teleport back aboard, lost crew members to random events, been murdered by boarding drones, and stranded myself in deep space when I got too greedy hunting for scrap. But I think the games of FTL I remember the most are the ones where I struggled, didn't get good RNG, but still came back from the brink to eke out a win against the Rebel flagship. Victory is always incredibly satisfying, and always makes me want to fire up another run. There are 28 different starting ship layouts, countless weapons and augments and ship systems, and 1,000,001 ways for your space exodus to unfold, making FTL one of the most compelling and variable indie roguelikes. Everspace 2. Everspace 2 took a game I didn't really care about, Everspace 1, and turned it into something really cool. The first Everspace was a bit more arcadey, a bit less polished, and had much less interesting progression. It was also difficult in a way that wasn't all that fun, thanks mostly to enemy lasers being stupidly hard to avoid. Everspace 2 vastly improved the space combat and turned the experience into more of a loot-based action RPG, which is one of my favorite genres, and ultimately crafted a much better space warfare experience. As I already mentioned, this is quite literally the oldest trope in sci-fi video games, and as someone who grew up with games like Rogue Squadron, I for one was ready to jump into the cockpit of a ship and blast enemy starfighters to smithereens. While endless loops of ship-to-ship combat can get a bit stale in concentrated doses, Everspace 2 does a few things to keep the experience fresh. First, the space combat itself is really smooth. The controls are clear and responsive. Enemy attacks are telegraphed in a way that feels fair but is never too easy, and the different ships you can pilot actually feel different, with different weapon systems that let you play tactically rather than just button mashing. That last part's really important because it keeps you wanting to engage with the new ship systems. Speaking of which, the looter-shooter gameplay loop is really solid here, which kept me excited to round up more and more ship parts. Another point in this game's favor is the incredibly varied environments that range from icy planets and wrecked space stations to asteroid fields and psychedelic stargates. This game looks and sounds awesome, which is half the fun of playing it. Finally, there's a serviceable story to give your adventures a bit more direction and add some stakes to all the barrel rolls and missile fire. Of all the games I played for this list, this one's the pinnacle of pure action-based space combat. Space Engine. It's a bit of a stretch to refer to this game as science fiction, and for that matter, a bit of a stretch to refer to Space Engine as a game in the first place. What it is an attempt to model the entire known universe for your own personal exploration and enjoyment. After a brief tutorial, Space Engine pretty much sets you free in the middle of the universe and says, have fun. While you can engage with more complex systems like tracing orbits or perusing planetary data, the basic controls are straightforward. Fly around space, zoom in and out, focus on particular bodies to rotate them or descend to their surface, and warp almost instantly to anywhere in the universe. Known parts of the universe are recreated as faithfully as reasonably possible, and unknown reaches are procedurally generated. Every single star in your field of view is clickable and visitable, along with the countless planets and moons and comets that orbit each distant speck of light. You can zip back and forth across our solar system, land on planets so distant they've never been imagined, come to rest at the barycenter of a binary star, pass the event horizon of a supermassive black hole, or conjure simulated attack ships off the shoulder of Orion. There is no objective or goal of Space Engine, but don't think about that for too long or you might start to question your own purpose as an impossibly tiny speck on one of the infinitely many tiny specks represented here. Space Engine gives me the same feeling as The Scale of the Universe, which, if you've never messed with, is an in-browser app that lets you zoom in and out from quarks and neutrinos, past pixels and earthworms and humans and the pyramids, all the way to Alpha Centauri and the Milky Way, and eventually the entire known universe. It's a mind-blowing piece of perspective, which I'll link in the description in case you've never checked out. But Space Engine manages to capture that same sense of scale, awe, and human fragility. Plus, it was made by just one guy, which makes it all the more impressive. Play this one in the dark, with headphones, and just marvel at the universe we live in. No Man's Sky. Two things about No Man's Sky. First of all, it's definitely on the AA, AAA, Indian Spirit only end of the spectrum. And second, this is one of the bigger redemption stories in gaming. If you only know one thing about No Man's Sky, it's probably that this game was panned at launch for overpromising and underdelivering. But if you haven't checked it out since, years of updates and creator support have developed No Man's Sky into a genuinely rich and rewarding experience. The core promise of No Man's Sky is an effectively infinite, procedurally generated universe of stars and planetary systems to explore, with infinite combinations of atmospheres, terrains, and xenofauna. Within that universe, you can do whatever you want, which initially didn't involve all that much, but now includes base building, resource gathering and terraforming, unearthing ancient ruins, cataloging alien life forms, trading at space stations for new ships and parts, learning alien languages and engaging in interspecies diplomacy, fighting space pirates, and flying into black holes. Despite all that, I actually find this game more meditative than thrilling. I don't know if it's the soundtrack or the retro-futuristic art style or just the slow and steady march of progress as you visit various planets and harvest more and more upgrade materials, but I think No Man's Sky is a very chill experience. The highlight for me is just taking in the visuals of all the different planets. Few games actually let the player boldly go where no man has gone before, but in No Man's Sky, the vastness of the procedural universe means you can literally visit planets that no other player has discovered, and ultimately, that's pretty neat. Outer Wilds. Of course, this list wouldn't be complete without my favorite indie game of all time. This is my third time talking about Outer Wilds in a video, and probably not the last, so at the risk of repeating myself, here's the bottom line. If you care about story, mystery, or sci-fi at all, do yourself a favor and play this game. And don't look anything up, just go in blind. But I guess I'll talk about some things that make Outer Wilds a great sci-fi game. For one thing, the physics of the miniature solar system in Outer Wilds are incredibly intricate and well designed. Throughout the 22-minute time loop, the planets never cease their orbital arcs, which I find really impressive. As you explore, say, Giant's Deep, it remains in orbit, bringing you closer or further away from other celestial bodies. And that's not the only dynamism over the 22 minutes. 2 planets in binary orbit pass sand back and forth like halves of an hourglass, burying one and draining the other. Another planet slowly but chaotically collapses into itself. As an icy comet nears its perihelion, the ice melts, revealing frozen tunnels beneath the surface. There are no load screens and no automatic landing procedures, so navigating requires a bit of Wayne Gretzky, go where the puck's going to be, not where it is type thinking. It really feels like this universe exists independently of the player, which I think fosters an incredible feeling of scale and of the player character's ultimate insignificance. I think the best space stories pit the brief and tiny flicker of sentient life against the absolute vastness of the void, and Outer Wilds does an amazing job telling the meaningful story of one alien race's quest to penetrate the mysteries of the cosmos, and another alien species' attempt to investigate their legacy. That's what you actually do in Outer Wilds. Investigate Nomai ruins, translate their written records, and see if you can bring their ambitions to bittersweet fruition. It must be mentioned that this game also includes incredible music, some solid humor, and the ability to roast marshmallows over a campfire. If you can brave the horror of space and find answers among the stars, Outer Wilds might just make you think about your own place in the universe. Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime. This is one of the most fun, clever, and silly games on this list, and one of the few multiplayer titles. You and up to 3 friends pilot a 2-dimensional spaceship around a vibrant neon galaxy, rescuing cartoon bunnies, frogs, and foxes. A fun Star Fox illusion.
Do a barrel roll!
And blasting alien warships with wacky combinations of weapons. Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime is crazy couch co-op chaos. Your spaceship contains multiple weapons, shield and navigation systems, and your little characters frantically scurry around the ship manning stations just in time to block incoming attacks, fire laser bursts, pilot the ship out of harm's way, or activate the ship's superweapon. Even the minimap is an onboard functionality, so checking your position means leaving your post at the helm or the starboard laser turret. Coordinating all this while the ship is under attack inevitably results in players yelling feverish instructions at one another, and occasional clumsy moments when all players simultaneously abandon their posts to activate the superpowered Yamato cannon, and leave the ship unshielded from attack or bumping into asteroids. But ultimately, that's what makes this game fun and memorable. You can also combine upgrade gems to create a wide variety of weapon, shield, and engine effects, like homing missiles, cluster lasers, saw blades, or spike balls on electric tethers, and have to navigate environmental hazards like asteroid fields or gravitational poles. Whether you're dipping the ship in and out of watery planetoids, fending off hordes of robot kamikazes, or narrowly escaping the blast radius of a doomsday bomb, Lovers is a silly good time. It's a pretty big universe out there, so there's plenty more space games to discover, and here's a few honorable mentions. Rebel Galaxy is a sprawling space western, think Firefly or Cowboy Bebop, with bounties and trade and ship-to-ship combat in a galaxy full of outlaws set to a blues rock soundtrack. It's decent fun, but it did make me wish there were more space westerns to explore. Crying Suns is a roguelike about a space clone commanding a fleet of warships across a randomly generated galaxy while outrunning a pursuing threat, encountering random events, and collecting scrap to upgrade your fleet. So it's essentially FTL, but on the scale of a space fleet instead of a single ship. My main critique of Crying Suns is that FTL is better. But if you're looking for something else to scratch that itch, Crying Suns is a solid game that does legitimately stand on its own and has some interesting lore to uncover. I recently played Starcom: Unknown Space, which has a really addicting gameplay loop. You pilot an extremely customizable ship around a massive galaxy, surveying planets, fighting a hostile alien fleet, gathering resources, and researching new parts and tech for your ever-evolving ship. I really enjoyed this one, and I think it's absolutely worth a look. Adrift, stylized as ADR-1FT, is a game about the sole survivor of a space station disaster floating around in zero-G and trying to return safely to Earth. The visuals are really good, but overall the gameplay is a bit slow-paced. I've also recently checked out Void Crew, which is a vibrant co-op game about players assuming different roles aboard a spaceship and teaming up to explore, survive, and take on other ships in chaotic space battles. Haven't played a ton, but it seems like a lot of fun. Meanwhile, definitely recommend your favorite space games, so we can all boldly go where you have gone before. Strange New Worlds, alien planets, colonization, and survival. Some of the most memorable and enduring settings in science fiction are imaginary planets and alien worlds. Think of Hoth or Tatooine, Arrakis, Krypton, or Pandora, not to mention fictionalized versions of Mars or the Moon, as in something like The Expanse or The Martian. Unless you're watching this in the future from a Martian colony, Earth is the only world that any of us know, so it's fun to imagine far-flung planets that operate totally differently from anything we're used to. The games in this category are entirely, or at least primarily, set on one particular world, or at most a small system of worlds. This could be for a variety of reasons. The protagonists could be stranded survivors in a futuristic castaway scenario, explorers, scientists, or soldiers scouting an uncharted planet, or themselves denizens of off-world colonies or alien civilizations. In any case, the star of these games is the world itself, because after all, that is sort of the point of employing an imaginative setting completely foreign to our real-world experience. As with the space genre, there isn't really a unifying gameplay theme to these titles. But this is the largest category on this whole list, and I think that's because it's a space where creativity can really shine, in gameplay, storytelling, and exotic visuals. If there's anything that unifies these games, it's a sense of adventure, and mystery, and exploration, and the thrill of the unknown. There's a huge diversity of creative and carefully crafted worlds out there to explore, so let's take a look. Subnautica. Subnautica is a fantastic game with a really unique alien world to explore. You are a futuristic Robinson Crusoe, a sole survivor stranded on an oceanic planet after the mysterious crash of the spacecraft Aurora. The goal of Subnautica is to stay alive by harvesting food and resources, constructing underwater shelters, and avoiding dangerous xenofauna in hopes of eventually finding a way off the planet. For some, this game might be horror adjacent, if you don't like deep-sea creatures, the suspense of icy black depths beneath your feet, or the claustrophobia of navigating underwater wrecks with limited oxygen. Now, in general, I'm not in love with survival games for two main reasons. First, having to continuously replenish your vitals is oftentimes annoying and repetitive. Although to be fair, trapping fish and desalinating water is at least a different spin on this mechanic. Second, most survival games are too directionless for my taste. However, Subnautica solves this second problem by weaving a genuinely good sci-fi story into the underwater survival adventure. Every time I set about gathering a cache of supplies, it was in preparation for an expedition to some new point of interest, which really kept me engaged and motivated throughout the game. The story is still your own, and everyone's experience will be unique. You can delve into the wreck of the Aurora to salvage useful materials and investigate the cause of the crash, explore the ruins and remains of previous visitors to the planet, catalog alien flora and fauna, or respond to mysterious signals and distress beacons. Subnautica does a great job of laying a breadcrumb trail of intriguing mysteries to probe, while also letting you explore the world at your own pace. There's also a pretty satisfying complexity ramp as you graduate from scuba diving in shallow reefs to piloting massive submarines and mechanized prawn suits in the cavernous deep-sea depths. This is an all-time classic indie game, and Planet 4546b is arguably the most in-depth and imaginative world in this genre. Planet of Lana. Planet of Lana is a beautiful cinematic platformer from indie developer Wishfully Studios that follows Lana and her alien cat-like companion Mui, as they attempt to rescue Lana's big sister Elo from an invasion of people-snatching robots. Planet of Lana shares a lot of gameplay DNA with puzzle platformers Limbo and Inside, but Lana and her planet are bright and adventurous and hopeful, instead of dark and disturbing, and the vibrant cel-shaded visuals that juxtapose otherworldly landscapes and hulking technological leviathans look like scenes out of a Miyazaki movie. I think this game was somewhat overlooked, but that's a shame because it's a really beautiful experience. The story is told without dialogue, or at least without intelligible dialogue, as the characters speak in a sort of alien gibberish, which is something I always love. You can totally read emotion and meaning from the character's intonation, which is both charming and really economical storytelling. There's also hints from the environment that this might be a planet of Earth colonists generations on who have forgotten their terrestrial origins, which is cool background lore. The gameplay of Lana is a fairly relaxing mix of puzzles with some light stealth, platforming, and timing elements, and the environments are used in some pretty creative ways. I guess you could say it's just a puzzle platformer, but that to me is like saying Limbo is just a puzzle platformer, or Hollow Knight is just a Metroidvania. I think Planet of Lana has some real soul, and something about this game just grabbed me. While it's never too taxing or thinky, the story has a real crescendo to it, a sense of rising tension and desperation that never slows down and culminates in a pretty satisfying ending. Video games scratch a lot of different itches, but sometimes I'm just in the mood to sit down and have an experience. And Planet of Lana delivers on that front a really concise and powerful journey. Deep Rock Galactic. Deep Rock Galactic is a fantastical online multiplayer co-op about heavily equipped dwarven miners airdropping onto the brightly colored, fully destructible planet Hoxie's 4, and completing mission objectives like mining resources, hunting and destroying alien eggs, salvaging derelict mini-mules, or protecting an on-site refinery as it collects and processes liquid morkite. As explained in the game's lore, Deep Rock Galactic, your employer, is the only company greedy enough to send its employees to this hostile but resource-rich planet where almost certain death awaits. The missions here are really punchy and fun, with a huge variety of environments, enemy types, difficulty levels, and randomly generated layouts. As mentioned, the cavernous depths are pretty much fully destructible, which provides players with a ton of navigational freedom. You can follow pre-existing cave structures or tunnel up and around obstacles for speed or stealth. There are 4 classes to pick from: a scout who traverses the mines quickly with a grapple gun, a gunner, which is basically the combat class, a driller who tunnels with ease and has some good crowd control abilities, and the engineer who shoots platforms out of his platform gun. They're all pretty good, but the different playstyles shine the most in multiplayer, where the roles complement each other for some solid team play. Between missions, you can grab a drink at the Abyss Bar, improve your weapons with scavenged materials at the Forge, or spend your hard-earned wages on new accessories and collectibles. You know, some good incentives to get you back out there earning those sweet credits. If you're up for some wackier planetary expeditions and you like the idea of dwarves in space, there's a ton of goofy fun to be had in Deep Rock Galactic. So grab a pickaxe and it's off to work you go. Cocoon. In Cocoon, you play as a little bug guy carrying dimensional orbs around on your back and hopping between multiple layers of mini-universes. Or maybe you're a big bug guy. There's no sense of scale to be had, so maybe in Cocoon the real world is the size of a Whovillian snowflake. Or maybe the Cocoon world is snowflake size compared to our world. That's not important. What is important is that this is one of the most clever and beautiful puzzle games in recent memory. The key conundrum here is that each orb can be placed on a pedestal, where it acts as a portal to the world of the same color, but each orb also provides an ability when carried around, like illuminating invisible pathways, phase-shifting ghostly green columns, or firing projectiles. This creates a lot of moments where you know you need to bring the orange orb over there, but it's seemingly impossible to get over there without leaving the orange orb in its current position. To make matters more complicated, it's also possible to nest orbs within other orbs, which leads to a lot of complex solutions that have to be thoughtfully set up and carefully unwound. The atmosphere in Cocoon is incredible, especially the way the different worlds all feel so distinct from one another, which is obviously why it lands itself in this category. The worlds all feel alien in an unsettling but oddly beautiful way, and Cocoon also features some set-piece boss fights that, despite feeling a little out of place in a puzzle game, are just pure spectacle. There's no dialogue, but the world itself adds color to your enigmatic mission, and the multiversal puzzles are worth your time. Not too brain-burny, but still really satisfying to solve, and the game only lasts a few hours, so it never wears out its welcome. Heaven's Vault. Heaven's Vault is a game about alien archaeology, which revolves primarily around the translation of a forgotten alien language called Ancient. You play as Elia El-Asra, a xenolinguist who zips around the nebula with her robot companion Six, amassing a treasure trove of cryptic artifacts and attempting to reconstruct the rise and fall of an interplanetary empire. This is a fairly dense and extremely dialogue-heavy game. There's a lot going on, a lot of obscure details to discover, and at first, an overwhelming amount of information to sift through. There's also a lot of ways for the modern-day story to unfold, as your choices affect the story in myriad ways. You can choose who to trust, who to befriend, how forthcoming to be with your research, and how to navigate the politics and religious zealotry of the Ioxian Protectorate. However, the main draw of this game is Ancient, the aforementioned language in which you slowly accumulate a vocabulary. According to director John Ingold, Ancient has a dictionary of over 3,000 words and draws inspiration from Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese writing systems. A particular challenge is that Ancient does not contain spaces, so dividing inscriptions into individual words can require a fair bit of parsing. Often the excitement of unearthing a new archaeological find is in discovering new context behind a difficult-to-translate morpheme, and there are loads of sites to investigate with no shortage of scrolls, inscriptions, and artifacts to translate. Was a particular item a religious relic, a royal sigil, or a simple farming tool? That's for you and your linguistic skills to determine. I will say, sailing around the nebula is incredibly drawn out and not fun. It should not be a part of this game. At least in the current version, they've patched in the ability to insta-travel to locations you've already visited, but it's still a bad part of the game. However, if you have the patience for it, there's an intriguing history of robots, rebellion, religion, and interplanetary colonization to uncover. Heaven's Vault is an incredibly unique twist on the puzzle genre, and well worth a look for lovers of lore and linguistics. Obduction. An open-ended first-person puzzle game from the creators of Myst and Riven, Obduction sees you explore a spherical chunk of Arizona landscape contained in a large bubble on an alien world. Your mission is to discover what's going on and find a way home, which is not so easy, as the world of Obduction is incredibly enigmatic. Obduction is a game that I perhaps respect more than I enjoy. You'll need a lot of patience to fully enjoy this game, thanks in part to an excruciatingly slow walk speed and obscene loading times that only become more prevalent as the game goes on. However, if you are a patient person who enjoys thinking through complicated problems, there's a great game here with an intriguing story about interspecies communication. Some of the solutions are really ingenious, especially the ones that require some pretty intense spatial reasoning, and the game does a good job of letting you see mysteries you can't quite reach, which fuels a lot of creative problem solving and ultimately provides a heaping dose of satisfaction when you finally make your way to a spot you've had your eyes on since the beginning. I also think this game looks pretty great, barring a few weird character models. Some of the alien environments in particular are cool and creative, and the lore behind this one puts a unique spin on some classic sci-fi tropes. I don't know, it's hard to say much more since this is one that depends heavily on both puzzle and story reveals, but if you like big, complicated puzzle boxes where everything fits together by the end, this might be a game for you. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. This is a game I went into with fairly low expectations, but it turned out to be one of the best surprises on this whole list. I absolutely adore this game, and I played through the story 4 separate times, ultimately achieving what I felt was a pretty good ending. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist chronicles the life and times of a teenager growing up in the first off-planet colony in Earth history. It features everything you'd expect from a coming-of-age story, like friendships, romance, and the inevitable loss of innocence, and everything you'd expect from an off-world colony sim, like exotic xenofauna, precursor alien ruins, and the tribulations of a fledgling colony struggling to find resources and adapt to a brave new world. Basically an expanded visual novel, each in-game month lets you devote your time to an activity, like learning a new skill in school or the greenhouse, exploring nearby areas, or relaxing with friends. The way you prioritize your time shapes the person you become, and the game spans 10 years, during which time you, your friends, and the entire colony are reshaped in dynamic ways. Another cool system in Teenage Exocolonist are the frequent skill checks that require you to pass a simple deck-building minigame. Your personal deck is made up of cards that represent key memories or personality attributes. Your starting cards are things like first words or crawling, but formative experiences, be they positive or negative, add new cards to your deck, which shape your overall personality and ability to pass difficult skill checks. Okay, this next thing's a light spoiler, but I feel like I have to explain it. After you finish the game, you can restart with all the knowledge of your previous life. This opens new dialogue options and new gameplay possibilities, but it also means you potentially have the foresight to prevent untimely deaths by accident, disease, or alien attack. On my second playthrough, I was trying to correct all my past mistakes, not always successfully, and kept learning new secrets about the planet I hadn't discovered in my first life. By my fourth playthrough, I was min-maxing like a fiend, befriending everyone and determined not to let anyone die on my watch. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist held my attention in a way that few games do, and even on my fourth run, I was discovering new things about the game. The story at times is genuinely moving and intriguing. The artwork is gorgeous, and the writing, as befits a game of this sort, is always on point. Play this game. You won't regret it. The Invincible. Starward Industries, the Polish studio behind The Invincible, was founded in part by a group of former CD Projekt Red developers, and like the Witcher series, The Invincible is based on the work of a Polish novelist. In this case, the 1964 book of the same name by science fiction author Stanisław Lem. The novel follows the crew of a spaceship called the Invincible, which lands on the distant Mars-like planet Regis 3 to investigate a strange metallurgical phenomenon and determine the fate of a previous expedition. The game follows the same events from a different perspective. You play as Yasna, an astrobiologist and member of a small crew of scientists who land on Regis 3 and become separated, turning a would-be research mission into a desperate rescue operation. Half survival story, half mystery, your primary mission is to return to your ship with as many of your crew as you can rescue, but this quickly becomes complicated by both the presence of unfriendly forces on Regis 3 and the planet's own mysterious ecosystem. The Invincible has been described by almost everyone as Firewatch in space, in part because it's a mysterious walking simulator with beautiful, vibrant landscapes, but mostly because you spend the entire game in radio conversation with your supervisor. And I think it's fair to say if you like the one game, you'll probably like the other. Overall, The Invincible is a very linear experience without much interesting gameplay, but where it shines is in the writing, the world building, and some pretty original story elements that challenge your initial perceptions. That said, you do make choices that influence the story, and there are multiple versions of the ending, so you're not purely experiencing the narrative. I thought the Invincible had something different to offer, and I really enjoyed digging into this world. RimWorld. I've invested a decent chunk of time into RimWorld, and I still feel I've barely scratched the surface. Each randomly generated start plops 3 wacky colonists with big personalities on a hostile alien world, and the game just unfolds in a million different directions from there. At its core, RimWorld is a colony sim about exploring an alien planet, expanding your base, and weathering a storm of chaotic and colorful random events, like raids, extreme weather, solar eclipses, disease, wild animals, or new characters wandering into your colony. At the start of each new game of RimWorld, you select an AI storyteller that will drive the events of the game, your options being Cassandra Classic, Phoebe Chillax, or Randy Random. Essentially, Cassandra causes events to unfold in a balanced way, with major threats spaced out over the game year. Phoebe creates a more relaxed experience with fewer and tamer events, and Randy offers up more or less true randomness. That means there's never a dull moment in RimWorld, because if nothing is happening now, it's time to prepare for whatever comes next. You'll also have to contend with individual characters bouncing off the world and each other in various ways, according to their personality traits, which can be decidedly inconvenient when colonists develop drug addictions, engage in cannibalism, or become bedridden with broken hearts or crippling depression. Most traits are relatively neutral. For instance, a colonist could be a teetotaler, a nudist, a night owl, a gourmand, a tortured artist, or a slow learner. But colonists could also be misogynists, pyromaniacs, psychopaths, or, worst of all, staggeringly ugly. RimWorld feels a bit to me like a weird mix of Civilization and Oregon Trail. Civ because the games unfold with tech progression and random events and expansion, and no two games will ever play out the same way. And Oregon Trail for the weird attachment you form with your colonists, and the inevitability that many of them will succumb to snake bites and disease. There are expansions for RimWorld that add everything from horror and monsters and psychic abilities to nobility and child rearing and religion, and the fun comes from the stories that arise from so many chaotic possibilities. This game is endlessly replayable and a modern classic. Sable. Sable is set on a vast desert planet littered with wrecked spaceships and old ruins, populated by a smattering of nomadic settlements. You are a young woman called Sable, about to embark on a sort of futuristic Rumspringa called the Gliding, where adolescent nomads leave their tribes to ride around the desert planet on customizable hoverbikes. Sable was apparently inspired by the scenes in The Force Awakens, where Rey scavenges parts from old Star Destroyers buried in the sands of Jakku, and a big part of Sable is indeed exploring and looting old wrecks. The other obvious inspiration here is Breath of the Wild. Sable lets you go in any direction, climb any surface until your energy meter runs out, and safely glide across the map from great heights. There's a huge emphasis on verticality, and some of the most satisfying moments in the game are the fulfillment of self-directed quests to reach the peak of some distant landmark. There are also actual quests and other story elements going on in the various settlements, most of which reward Sable with new outfits, masks, and parts for her hoverbike. You can take on various jobs, find collectibles, interact with a fun cast of characters, and discover secrets about the history of the planet. The result is an experience that feels grand and adventurous, but also personal to each player, a feeling underscored by the ending in which Sable's path in life is determined by the player's choices. Two other things of note. I really dig the art style of Sable, which uses cell shading and really clean outlines that feel like a sketch or an illustration. It's a unique look and it brings a fantastical quality to the game's exploration. Second, the vibe of Sable would not be complete without the soundtrack, which was done by Michelle Zauner's indie group Japanese Breakfast. The dreamy lo-fi pop sounds really set the tone for desert exploration, and make Sable one of the chillest games on this list. There's so many games in this category worth considering, like Ghost Song, a Metroidvania that sees you explore the depths of an alien moon. There's some really beautiful and atmospheric environments there, and a good soundtrack, although the gameplay can get a little repetitive at times. One of the more unique games I've played is In Other Waters, which is about a marine xenobiologist exploring a watery planet from the perspective of her suit's AI. It's a very cerebral game in which you mostly interact with maps and interfaces. You essentially are the heads-up display, and it might not be for everyone, but it's really creative, and it's from the same dev who made Citizen Sleeper. Planet of the Eyes is a cute but tiny platformer about a robot exploring a vibrant and surprisingly hostile planet, which took me less than 2 hours to run through. Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain 2 are 2D and 3D roguelikes respectively about a survivor or survivors stranded on an alien planet, gathering upgrades and experience and fending off hordes of enemies as they attempt to progress through a series of levels and escape the planet. The gimmick here is that the game's difficulty goes up every few minutes, so you have to balance rushing through the levels versus taking your time looking for upgrades and powering up. This is a series I'd like to play more, although it is true that the Risk of Rain IP is now owned by Gearbox, which is not an indie studio. Astroneer is a crafting and exploration game set in a destructible planetary system with a bright, neon pastel aesthetic I really like. The whole gathering crafting genre is something I've personally grown a little bored with, but this is a really good entry in that genre. If that's a genre that appeals to you, you should definitely check out Starbound, which is essentially Terraria in space and has an incredible amount of content to discover and loads of ways to play, plus one of the best soundtracks. Axiom Verge is another retro Metroidvania that also has to do with AI and parallel timelines, but is set on an enigmatic alien world populated by giant mechanical beings. There are always more creative and memorable worlds to discover, so recommend your favorite alien planets in the comments. Know when to hear you scream. Horror, mystery, and isolation. We're taking a left turn here into the creepy, dark, and suspenseful, which has honestly always been a core pillar of the sci-fi genre. Technological development can have unintended side effects, and this is the genre that examines fears of unleashing deadly, dark, or horrifying consequences. You might confront experiments gone awry, malevolent nanotech viruses, AIs gone rogue, prisons of the mind, extraterrestrial monstrosities, or unseen terrors beyond our understanding. Decades of disturbing science fiction from The Twilight Zone or The Thing to M3gan all take the genre in different directions. But there is one piece of media that has shaped the sci-fi horror genre more than any other, and that is the Alien franchise. It has so many elements that have become standard genre fare. A confined, claustrophobic setting with no way to escape, a dwindling crew with suspect motives, a distress call from an abandoned facility, limited weapons or equipment, and an unseen threat so deadly it can't be confronted directly, but has to be stealthed around, or at the last extremity, blown out the airlock. This collection of tropes has had a particular influence on the structure of video game horror, and has led to what I would call the standard model of indie sci-fi horror. Maybe you wake up from cryostasis, answer a distress call, or perhaps the game just begins in media res. But whatever the case, you find yourself alone in an apparently abandoned ship or research station. Something disastrous occurred just before the start of the game, and the rest of the crew is missing, dead, or not to be trusted. Your tasks are to survive, investigate the mystery, and gather enough resources to confront or evade the central threat. I think another reason this overall model appeals to indie developers is that it means you don't have to create many or any character models, just environments, which are easier to do. Some of these games are horror light, or horror-adjacent mysteries, but they all share similar DNA. At least one of the games in this section turns out not to be a horror game at all, but I can't say which one without spoiling it, and that's sort of the point. The tension in these games comes from the fear of the unknown, and with that in mind, I'll do my best to avoid spoilers. So, steel your nerves, and let's face the darkness. Signalis. Signalis follows an LSTR Elster class replicant, who wakes up in a crashed spaceship on an icy planet and attempts to locate her missing partner in the planetary outpost/mining facility. It's a Resident Evil-style survival horror exploration game with puzzles and mysteries and hostile undead replicants reanimated by some mysterious affliction. You can sneak around the facility avoiding enemies, or equip yourself with handguns, stun batons, shotguns, or SMGs, and protect yourself with deadly force. Like most survival horror games, ammo is in extremely short supply, so every shot is a strategic decision with a valuable resource at stake. A few of the puzzles in this one I thought were pretty clever, like this one that has you replicate a key card by finding others and deducing the correct pattern. A lot of the items you find around the facility will pique your curiosity and drive exploration, like a key to an as-yet unexplored room, or a sheet of codes that will no doubt prove useful at some point. At the heart of Signalis, however, is the relationship between Elster and her missing partner. Their story is told achronologically and in waves, but some of the story beats pack a punch, and some of the most sinister parts of the game intersect with their relationship in unexpected ways. This is the part of the game I was the most invested in, and the ending, or endings because this game has multiple endings, makes you feel something. You meet a few other characters throughout the game, and each one had a backstory and a motivation that, let's just say, felt right at home in the horror section. I should probably stop talking about the story because Signalis is best when the turns sneak up on you, but suffice to say this is a game where not everything is as it seems. There's also a lot of musical and literary symbolism in Signalis, and it's an interesting one to discuss with others who've played it. All in all, a standout entry in sci-fi survival horror. Tacoma. Tacoma is a walking simulator / disaster mystery from the makers of Gone Home that sees you board an abandoned space station and investigate what exactly happened to the crew. To do so, you are equipped with an AR device that lets you replay recorded scenes of the crew taken from various points over the previous year. Within each memory, you can scrub the timeline back and forth, track various members through the scene, or freeze frame important moments. The result feels like a cross between Return of the Obra Dinn, Unheard, and of course Gone Home, but set in space. Most of the memories have multiple threads, which you'll want to rewind and replay multiple times, gradually gaining more context behind the events that transpired. There's no way to fail at this game. There are no tests or knowledge checks, and the only reward for absorbing the story is finding out what happens in the story. However, Tacoma does a great job with achronological storytelling. You encounter most of the flashbacks completely out of order, in a way that continuously raises more questions and drives player curiosity. I really enjoyed Tacoma, and I like the way the story forces you to piece together what happened back to front. Without spoiling anything, Tacoma has things to say about corporatocracies, artificial intelligence, and human cooperation in an emergency. I will say the ending and the overall takeaway were different than what I was expecting going in a way that I appreciated and that stuck with me. If you're into story-heavy games or walking simulators with a sci-fi setting, or if you liked Gone Home, check out Tacoma. Code 7. This game is an absolute thrill ride, which is crazy for a game that's 80 to 90% text-based. Code 7 is an episodic, story-driven hacking adventure that begins with a pair of investigators boarding an unresponsive space station and, you guessed it, trying to figure out what happened to the crew. You play as Alex, a hacker whose primary mission is to prevent an insidious AI from infecting Earth with the malignant Code 7 virus. Despite being primarily text-based, Code 7 manages to feel extremely cinematic, not least thanks to full voice acting and a tense soundtrack. This is a game that has to be played on PC, with a keyboard, with you pretty much 100% dialed in. Which in general comes at a cost for me, because I'm a serial multitasker and like to listen to podcasts or rewatch shows when I play games, but this is worth the undivided attention. Code 7 is played entirely by typing into a command line interface, and gameplay involves accessing files and intercepting communications, installing network jammers and performing brute force attacks, bypassing security systems and traversing networks using what the internet tells me are at least quasi-genuine hacking techniques.
I hacked faster than I've ever hacked before.
Each episode of Code 7 is set in a new location, with new characters and dramas to confront, but everyone feels like a tense race against the clock. At time of writing, 4 of 5 episodes have been released, so I can't vouch for the ending of Code 7, but what's been released is really good and engaging. Almost anything else I could say about the story is some kind of spoiler, so I'll leave it there, but this is a compelling game with strong emotional through lines, riveting mysteries, social commentary, and most of all, pretty unique gameplay. SOMA. SOMA is set in yet another mysteriously abandoned research facility, but in what I consider a nice change of pace, this one is underwater. The protagonist of SOMA is a modern-day Canadian with a brain injury, who signs up for an experimental brain scan and suddenly wakes up a century later, confused and alone, in the aforementioned research facility. Everyone else in the facility is dead or missing, and rogue machines stalk the dimly lit corridors, forcing you to stealth your way around the station to scrounge up some answers. If you've consumed your fair share of sci-fi fare, you probably clocked pretty quickly where this initial twist is headed, but there are plenty more twists and turns in the narrative to keep you invested in the world of SOMA. There's secrets and tragedies to discover, underwater segments, body horror, and cults, not to mention a ramp of increasingly twisted robot hybrids to contend with. By the way, side note, I think first-person video games have the highest horror potential of any medium in existence. And that is because they combine the possibility of anything happening with the fact that you are controlling the camera. If you're watching a slasher flick, there can be jump scares and stuff, but you're just watching a screen, not actively participating. Even if you walk through an actual haunted house, you can obviously walk or look wherever, and maybe people can jump out at you, but things can't materialize behind you or vanish from sight the way they can in a video game. In video games, anything can happen, and you have to turn and face it. Anyway, SOMA's not that scary. That was just a general commentary on the medium, but it's still a really good entry in the horror mystery genre. It always gives you compelling reasons to keep exploring, to keep pressing ahead, and to find answers. And some of the ideas explored in SOMA, like identity, consciousness, and human relationships, will stick with you after the credits roll. Inside. Inside is a creepy side-scroller about a boy on a mysterious but very determined quest to infiltrate a research facility. The reasons for this mission are both spoilerific and open to interpretation, as Inside employs Playdead Studios' trademark silent storytelling, but it's a stunning visual adventure with a terrifically dark atmosphere, and some implied themes of identity and transhumanism. Look, at this point, Inside is an all-time classic, so if you're into the sinister sci-fi setting, just check it out. If you've played Inside, you'll no doubt agree it more than earns its place in this genre, and if you haven't, here's the deal. Inside is a 3-hour experience that you will not forget. The gameplay is a series of clever and thematic, if at times frustrating, trial-and-error puzzles that deliver swift and grisly death if you mess up. I thought some of the solutions were more visually cool than logically satisfying, but I was never held up for too long on any one puzzle, and I enjoyed them for the most part. That said, I do suspect that many of Inside's negative reviews come from players who got fed up with the puzzles, which is fair because the puzzles are not what players will remember most about Inside. What you will remember is the haunting atmosphere, the gradual crescendo of intrigue and tension and horror, and one of the best ever video game endings. Seriously, it's an all-timer. This isn't my favorite game of all time or anything, but I feel like Inside is one of those games that just absolutely 10 out of 10 nailed what it was going for. Check it out if you haven't. Duskers. Duskers is a suspenseful and incredibly unique horror title about a tech scavenger exploring a galaxy ravaged by an unknown extinction event. There are a lot of flavors of sci-fi horror, but this might be the one I gravitate towards the most. In Duskers, you dock with derelict space vessels and deploy a customizable team of drones whose function is to carefully scout ships and strip them of valuable resources. Between missions, you can use collected scrap to upgrade and repair drones, or outfit them with modules like shields, turrets, or teleportation. However, the real meat of the game are the tense forays into abandoned spacecraft, which are a combination of methodical tactical planning and occasional crises, the stress of which is exacerbated by the control scheme. Like Code 7, Duskers is played entirely with a keyboard, with you typing out instructions in real time. You issue orders to your squad of bots through a command line interface, instructing drones to navigate to specific rooms, tow other drones, gather resources, scan nearby rooms, interface with the ship to collect intel or toggle airlocks, or even activate a self-destruct function. The most heart-stopping of these is the scan function, which will demonstrate, at the worst possible times, that you are not alone. Duskers manages to wring an awful lot of tension out of a very simple, grainy interface, because although you never see more than indistinct outlines, the presence of hostile entities shapes the entire gameplay. Ideally, you won't confront threats head-on, but trap them in irrelevant rooms, blow them out of an airlock, deter them with sonic pulses, suffocate or irradiate biological threats remotely, or simply stealth around the ship. But you can't play perfectly forever, and when a threat escapes containment, things immediately escalate into a chaotic emergency. As mentioned, it is especially difficult and stressful to type commands calmly and quickly when a leaper is ripping your precious drones to shreds. And losing a favorite drone in Duskers can be absolutely devastating. You develop a real attachment to these little guys, and the miniature stories you tell about them form the most memorable moments as you marshal your bots to success and failure. I think Duskers is an extremely original game with some of my favorite visuals, a well-designed world, and incredibly tense and creative gameplay. Deliver Us the Moon. About half an hour into this game, I was ready to write it off. Although some parts of the game look really good, the character movement is pretty janky. The story was a bit jumbled at first, and some of the early puzzles felt like weird busy work. Also, the game uses a third-person camera when you're walking around, but a first-person camera when you're floating in 0G, which I find to be a little disorienting. However, I stuck with it out of commitment to this very list, and by the end I was both intrigued and genuinely moved by the story. And I even enjoyed some of the later gameplay segments, especially the stuff with the drones. The premise of this game is that a newfangled energy transfer tech allows vital resources to be transmitted from the moon to an otherwise resource-depleted Earth. But the whole system went offline a few years ago, and you're headed off on a last-ditch Apollo mission to check on the moon colony, find out what happened, and hopefully get the system back online. What follows is a wild ride through rockets and space elevators, actual space, abandoned space stations and a lunar colony, moon trains, and a perilous trek across the lunar surface. It's, loosely speaking, a puzzle game, and at various points you mess with electrical wiring, pilot drones, adjust satellite dishes, drive a lunar rover, or engage in stealth sections. It's a bit like an Uncharted game, where, now you're doing this, and now you're doing this, and you just sort of go with it. No one section is long enough to be what the game is about, so you are constantly on your toes and adapting to whatever comes next. While that can be hard to latch onto from a gameplay perspective, I think it works for an entry in the horror, mystery, thriller genre. Because of course, like most games in this section, the lunar station in Deliver Us the Moon was visited by an unknown catastrophe before the start of the game, and part of the suspense and intrigue is solving the mystery of what went down. And despite a shaky start, the end of this game is surprisingly affecting, and I thought a great payoff for the whole experience. Carrion. Carrion is a unique take on the monster genre, set in a burned-out research facility reeling from a recent disaster. An amorphous, tentacled monster has escaped containment and stalks the laboratory, hiding in the shadows, slithering through the ventilation system, and violently picking off scientists and security one by one. The twist in Carrion? That monster is you. You begin as an embryonic red blob with limited offensive capabilities, but as you absorb fractured DNA samples and biomass from slaughtered scientists, you gradually mutate into an eldritch monstrosity capable of slamming soldiers against the ceiling, sprouting lethal spikes, or puppeteering enemies with parasitic brain tendrils. That being said, the xenomorphs really make it look easy, because murdering scientists while avoiding detection is tricky business. The baby version of the monster is particularly vulnerable, so stealth is often the best course of action. But it's that much more fun whenever you do get the chance to do a violent rampage. Most importantly, the physicality of the monster in Carrion is really good. It feels meaty and responsive, and moves in a really organic way that's just fun to control. Anyway, this is a pretty short play, and it earns big points in my book for creativity. The satisfying crescendo from minuscule biomass to tentacled monstrosity, and the sheer joy of slithering and rampaging your way through the research facility. After playing quite a few games in this genre, it was satisfying for once to turn the tables and become the nightmare myself. Observation. As far as the initial premise of this one goes, it's a lot less fantastical and a lot more grounded in real-world tech. The Observation is a modern-day or near-future space station with chambers operated by US, Russian, and Chinese space agencies. You'll be shocked to learn that this game is set in the immediate aftermath of an unknown disaster, with an astronaut called Emma Fisher being the sole survivor. But the more interesting thing about Observation is that you don't play as Emma. Instead, you play as the station's AI, Sam. At first, you are confined to the station's mainframe, and can only switch points of view between the station's security cameras, but later you can inhabit drones and other devices for much more diverse gameplay. It's an interesting take, and definitely the hook of the game, but it's also more than just a gimmick. Of all the games that have you play as an AI, this one does perhaps the best job of making you feel like something other than human. That, I think, is the number one selling point of this game, the totally unique gameplay perspective. At the start of the game, you'll put out fires by engaging the fire suppression system, search for missing crew by hopping between cameras, and hack into ship systems to assess the damage, but things only escalate from there. Eventually, the story veers into some pretty wild territory, which is better left unspoiled, but will definitely keep you guessing until the end. Also of note, this game has a really cool opening credits sequence that feels reminiscent of the Stranger Things intro. It's a nice touch that sets the mood and really lets you know you're in for a cinematic experience. This is a fairly unique sci-fi horror game that packs some memorable visuals, and also has one of the crazier endings. Looking for more scares? Stasis is an isometric point-and-click survival mystery about a guy who wakes up from cryosleep aboard an illegal medical research vessel and sets out to find his wife and daughter. As you'd expect, it combines puzzle solving, a dark atmosphere, and some big reveals to deliver a really solid horror game. The Complex is a choose-your-own-adventure FMV game, think Black Mirror's Bandersnatch, about Katie from Letterkenny trying to investigate a nanobots gone wrong mystery in an underground laboratory before oxygen runs out. It's a total B-movie, but it's ambitious and silly, and I'm always intrigued by anyone attempting this kind of thing. In Iron Lung, you are welded into a tiny submarine and have to navigate an ocean of blood, using only a map, an external camera, and onboard sensors. It's an extremely claustrophobic, short-form game with good atmosphere and a big impact, plus a really unique gameplay design. And of course, for some truly spine-tingling horror, in which your extremely sus crewmates may have been replaced by nefarious imposters, you could check out a little mobile game called Among Us. Inspired by Mafia, Among Us is probably second only to Animal Crossing New Horizons on the list of games that defined the COVID pandemic. This is also another rare chance to become the monster yourself, which, depending on your personality, is arguably the most fun way to play. There's no shortage of sci-fi horror games lurking out there, but I tried to highlight a real variety. However, be sure to recommend the ones that haunt your nightmares. Neon Streets, Cyberpunk and Dystopia. You might have noticed that the rapid technological advancement of the last few decades has not led to some beautiful and fair utopia, but instead just exacerbated and magnified the same old problems we've always faced. Cyberpunk stories pretty much extrapolate that observation into the future, and explore social issues through a sci-fi lens. They also tend to imagine a post-national world with humanity packed into multicultural, corporate megacities, with a distinct Japanese or more recently Chinese influence, and an endless barrage of flashy advertising, hence the neon streets. The The cyberpunk genre is in fact inherently economic. In the words of Neuromancer author William Gibson, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. There is always a looming corporate conglomerate, an oppressive state police force, or a hegemonic cartel that regulates and controls the use of technology. The word punk and the term cyberpunk comes from the counterculture that arises against the enforced order and uniformity of these oppressive systems. You know, those angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection. Expect rampant drug use, body modification, and more overt acts of subversion against the systems of power, like black market arms dealing, hacking, or acts of terrorism. More often than not, these stories revolve around crime, be that the punishment of crimes by government agents and super assassins, the investigation of crimes, corruption, and conspiracy in detective noir stories, or the struggles of outcasts, immigrants, and androids whose very existence may be a crime in the eyes of the state. This is also a massively popular aesthetic, and plenty of games merely borrow cyberpunk tropes, like sprawling cities, futuristic techno-slang, cybernetic enhancements, and inevitably the most iconic pair of East meets West cyberpunk weapons, baseball bats and katanas. Whether we're diving into a gritty dystopian nightmare or just off on a slick sci-fi adventure, I'm here for what has become one of the most iconic genres of science fiction. So, let's go. Sanabi. Sanabi is a pixelated action side-scroller about a retired super soldier and a teenage hacker girl teaming up to investigate a giant cyberpunk city whose entire population disappeared overnight without a trace. Part mystery, part revenge story, and part wild action platformer, this is a game that really intrigued and surprised me. There are two main things that stand out about Sanabi. The first is the gameplay, which revolves around the protagonist's bionic grapple arm. It's very physicsy and lets you slingshot yourself around the city like a cyberpunk Spider-Man, but it also has a pretty steep difficulty curve. Like, this game is not doing the work for you or providing much aim assist, so you really have to perfect the timing and the angles of your grapple shots. There are some platforming sections and boss fights that really test your mastery of the system, and when you finally start to feel fast and fluid, it's oh so satisfying, and doesn't feel like anything else I've played. At the start of the game, I was crashing into walls, mistiming jumps, and missing grapples altogether, but by the end I was flinging myself around the screen and through my enemies like a maniac, and that felt good. The second thing that stands out about Sanabi is the story. This is a really good one, guys, and I can't say too much without spoiling it, but it will stick with you. There's some good twists and turns, but it's more about the emotional beats and the character relationships. A lot of the earliest scenes in the game are completely recontextualized by later revelations, which is a storytelling feature I always enjoy, and the ending is pretty great. There's also a ton of interesting background lore and solid writing and some environments that make the world of Sanabi come alive. I'm really glad I gave this one a play, and if all that sounds good, you should too. The Ascent. The Ascent is an isometric looter shooter in which you and up to 3 friends battle your way to the top of a massive mega metropolis arcology, contending with various factions in the chaotic aftermath of a corporate collapse. The gameplay is essentially cyberpunk Diablo, swapping bows and swords for submachine guns and baseball bats, and magic spells for cybernetic enhancements like energy shielding, vampiric swarms of nanobots, or dead-eye retinal scan auto-targeting. You can build a sniper, a psychotic bruiser, or a tech wizard with a squad of attack drones and blast your way through the neon streets, looting weapons and augments and upgrades from the corpses in your wake. The Ascent is pretty much exactly what you'd expect from an ARPG, but too many games in this genre are just bog-standard fantasy settings, so it's nice to get a sci-fi spin on some favorite mechanisms. Despite some jank and a few navigation issues, I like the world of The Ascent, and there's a perfectly satisfying loop of combat and upgrades to keep you plugged in. There is actually a decent story, but it's more about the gameplay for me on this one, which is arguably best experienced with a friend, since this is one of the few couch co-ops on offer. This is also one of the games that leans into the cyberpunk genre in a really tropey way, like it's willing to get silly with it. Some of the quests and in-game humor feel a bit like Borderlands humor, which I think kind of works here. This is the video game equivalent of a popcorn flick. It's not winning any Oscars, but it's definitely a good time. If you, like me, wish there were more sci-fi action RPGs, definitely check out The Ascent. Katana Zero. Katana Zero is a brutal but stylish pixelated side-scroller about contract killing in a dystopian mega-metropolis. Zero, the protagonist, is a precog with a drug habit, a samurai sword, and a past that haunts his nightmares. Each chapter of Katana Zero is framed by a visit to Zero's psychiatrist, who dispenses a dose of the drug Chronos and a dossier on the next target for Zero to hunt down and kill. More story beats unfold between missions, but the missions themselves are tactical puzzles that involve stealth, timing, and sometimes plain old slicing and dicing. Each of your deaths or failed attempts is framed as a precognition about an outcome best avoided, which is a neat way to integrate story and gameplay. Some games are style over substance, but this game for me is style and substance. It's obvious a lot of thought and effort went into the combat, which feels incredibly responsive, fluid, and lethal. You can deflect bullets with your katana, dodge roll past shielded enemies, and enter bullet time for bloody finishers. The mission replays are stylized as these cool black and white film-grain security cam shots, and during cutscenes you can also interrupt anyone who's talking by talking over them or just killing them, because the developer felt a super assassin wouldn't necessarily stand around waiting on dialogue. It's little choices like that that really elevate a game for me. There's also what I assume is an in-game Nathan For You reference, so one bonus point. This is a game I've talked about a lot, and I'm a big fan of the story, the gameplay, and the overall atmosphere. Definitely a solid entry in the cyberpunk genre. VA11 Hall A. Better known as Valhalla, this is a game about serving drinks in a dingy cyberpunk bar of the same name. And that's it. Valhalla takes place over the better part of a month, during which you report to work each day, mix up drinks, and get that bread. If I had to compare it to anything else, I'd compare it to Papers, Please. Both games involve paying the bills through fairly mechanical labor, while interacting with a series of strangers and occasionally influencing their lives through your work. Described by its creators as a booze-em-up about waifus, technology, and post-dystopia life, Valhalla serves up glimpses of a wider world through a steady stream of patrons who drink away their troubles and spill their life stories when sufficiently lubricated. Despite being a dialogue-heavy game, you don't actually make any dialogue choices. Instead, your only way to influence the story is through mixology. That might mean deducing a patron's drink of choice from cryptic hints. Maybe they're not even sure what they want. Or it might mean keeping them sober by surreptitiously serving up non-alcoholic bevies. As the month goes on, you'll get to know the regulars, check in with their stories, and perfect the recipes of drinks like the Gut Punch or the Piano Woman. Also, kind of a random part of this game, but I like that you can set the playlist for the bar, effectively giving you control over the game's soundtrack. I guess I just like getting to set the atmosphere for the bar. You'll hear about nanotech and mercenary work and civil unrest, but the game never becomes about any of those things. The patrons of Valhalla are the main characters of other stories, and you're just a bartender NPC they occasionally chat with. Observer, System Redux. Observer is a very dark, horror-adjacent vision of a dystopian future set in cyberpunk Poland, where seemingly most of the population is crammed into low-cost tenement housing and trapped in a cycle of digital plague, addiction, and violence. The criminal underworld is kept in check by a futuristic police force known as Observers, who are sort of cybernetically enhanced detectives in the employ of the nebulous Carrion Corporation. You play as Daniel Lazarski, an aging observer who's voiced by and modeled after Rutger Hauer, the guy from Blade Runner who gives the speech about seeing the Tannhauser Gate and having a cry in the rain. To be honest, his performance isn't incredible, but no doubt his casting brought attention to the game and helped the devs up their cyberpunk street cred, so fair play to them. Anyway, this time it's personal, as you respond to an unexpected phone call from your estranged son, Adam, who may or may not be the decapitated corpse in the first abandoned apartment you investigate. That's a little sci-fi touch I like. Criminals in this cyberpunk future can inject corpses with a chemical solution that makes DNA identification impossible. Bit of an arms race between advanced technological methods of detection and black market counterintelligence. Speaking of which, you can toggle between electromagnetic or biovision to scan the environment for clues both technological and organic, or hack into citizens' minds for information. Best not to say too much about the story itself, but trust that there are plenty of disturbing twists and turns, and the hacking sequences are especially memorable. This game is extremely graphic and grimy, which is right at home in the cyberpunk genre, but if that's not your bag, maybe skip this one. If it is, you can immerse yourself in some unique and visceral cyberpunk noir, and maybe solve a crime in the process. Citizen Sleeper. Citizen Sleeper is a game about a simple android making their way in the galaxy, or more specifically on a rundown space station called Erlen's Eye. You play as a sleeper, a brain-scanned consciousness copy-pasted into a biosynthetic body and designed to perform hard labor until the point of planned obsolescence. Suddenly freed from your corporate enslavers, Citizen Sleeper is about surviving, finding a purpose, and making a life on the Eye, while befriending or antagonizing colorful characters from various factions and contending with hard economic realities, like the constant need to consume stabilizer drugs that stave off the aforementioned obsolescence. Citizen Sleeper plays out a bit like a worker placement board game. Each day you roll a set of dice and assign those dice to various locations on the Eye, which represent activities the sleeper can undertake. Some locations require specific dice rolls, while others grant differing odds of success depending on the number used. There are a ton of interesting story threads and intriguing characters that constantly pull you in different directions, so every cycle you'll have to make tough choices about which actions to prioritize. Now, I'm pretty convinced that parts of this game are not fun on purpose. Part of the point of Citizen Sleeper, I think, is to make you viscerally feel the sheer exhaustion and relentless drudgery that accompany the daily struggle for survival. There are often cycles where you want to pursue your overarching goals, but can't, because your basic survival needs take precedence over everything else. I get it, and this is a neat way to illustrate the near impossibility of upward mobility and the crushing weight of economic oppression, but there were definitely times I wished I could just not worry about it and get on with my fictional life, which, I don't know, I guess that's the point. Late-stage capitalist angst aside, there's a good story here with a lot of branching paths, multiple endings, and a few heart-wrenching decisions. Really clever design, and definitely a memorable RPG. Ghost Runner. Ghost Runner is a lot like Neon White, or I guess it's more accurate to say that Neon White is a lot like Ghost Runner, since Ghost Runner came out 2 years earlier. Both games are ultra-fast-paced, first-person free-running shooter platformers with one-hit-point protagonists and tricky levels that often require dozens of resets. In Ghost Runner, you're a reactivated, cybernetically enhanced super assassin, murderizing your way through a massive skyscraper city in an effort to bring down the tyrannical Keymaster. The plot has a lot of Matrix-esque twists and turns, but like many games in this genre, I'd say the plot is pretty secondary to the gameplay. It's a mix of a few cutscenes and a lot of voiceover during missions, some of which you'll be subjected to many times as you rerun difficult levels. I think the plot is intriguing if you get into it, but definitely the draw of Ghost Runner is the precision dash and slash speedrunning. As the game goes on, you can expand your repertoire with skills like wall running, bullet deflection, and a ranged attack, but the core gameplay remains the same. Run through levels as fast as you can, murder everyone, and don't get killed. Like so many games in the violent speedrunning subgenre, the levels feel more puzzle-oriented than action-oriented, in that the game rewards careful planning, experimentation, and learning enemy patterns more than it rewards fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants reflexive combat. Worth mentioning, this game also has some really terrific cutscenes and an interesting skill system that uses polyomino upgrades. There's also a sequel, which I think was received mostly positively, but I haven't played it, so if you have, let me know how it compares. As dark as it sometimes gets, the cyberpunk genre is a fun and stylish corner of the sci-fi world, with a lot of great games to discover. If you want a non-stop boss rush with a vaguely cyberpunk aesthetic, check out Fury, which follows a mysterious prisoner attempting to escape a futuristic prison by defeating his captors one by one in bombastic, bullet-hell combat. Ruiner is another twin-stick action shooter in a pretty well-fleshed-out cyberpunk world with cool combat, cutscenes, and character lore. Pretty similar to the Ascent, I would say with less character customization, but more interesting story beats overall. Techno Babylon is a point-and-click cyberpunk adventure with some great characters, quality writing, and plenty of mysteries and conspiracies to unravel. Worth a play if you're a fan of that genre. Anno Mutationum mixes gorgeous side-scrolling combat with a mystery that leads you all over a massive city, meeting colorful characters, doing odd jobs, and beating up goons with futuristic weaponry. It's a little bit long for what it is, but still worth checking out if you're a cyberpunk superfan. Transistor is Supergiant Games' take on a cyberpunk world, so if you like Hades or Bastion, you'll probably also enjoy Transistor. Definitely one of the more stylish games in the genre, with a few neat ideas behind the combat. Beyond a Steel Sky is a follow-up to the 1994 dystopian point-and-click game Beneath a Steel Sky, and is set in a world that juxtaposes a massive technologically advanced city and the barren nuclear wasteland outside its walls. Your character is an outsider tracking a missing child through the alleged utopia, and there's AI and crime and government conspiracy to confront. And you never know, we could be headed for a dystopian future in the real world. So in the meantime, trade some more sick wrecks in the black market that is the comments section. Next-gen warfare. Super soldiers, mechs, and advanced weaponry. This is the genre of science fiction that imagines bigger and badder ways to blow up your enemies, or sometimes new enemies to confront. There might be an alien invasion, a futuristic World War III, biologically mutated monstrosities, or a mechanized AI revolution. But whatever the case, you're fighting a war that must be won at all costs, sometimes on behalf of humanity as a whole. If a game in this genre is action-oriented, you are likely to be a highly trained, genetically altered, or cybernetically enhanced super soldier, wielding high-tech weaponry or piloting a heavily armored mech suit. However, it's just as likely that a game in this genre places you in command of a futuristic army, a strike team, or a hit squad, and grounds itself in thinky, tactical gameplay. Either way, I 100% guarantee you will be unlocking upgraded weapons or units or modules, and that the game will be broken up into distinct, high-stakes missions, which will often, but not always, be procedurally generated. Some games in this category will emphasize stealth and infiltration, while others will emphasize in-your-face, bloody, bombastic combat. Sometimes you get to make a strategic choice between the two approaches. In general, these games are not attempting to comment on society, explore meaningful themes, or make you think. This is a genre about blowing stuff up with crazy sci-fi weapons and having fun doing it. And you know what? That is pretty fun. So let's lock and load. Helldivers. Helldivers is a fast-paced isometric twin-stick shooter that sees you and up to 3 friends airdrop onto procedurally generated hostile planets to complete hectic missions with punchy objectives. You might, for instance, destroy alien bug nests, retrieve a black box, defuse landmines, or escort a convoy, all in the face of non-stop alien attacks. There are 3 distinct alien species, with a variety of enemy types and a whole host of planetary environments to infiltrate. Each mission, you can put together a unique weapon loadout for your Helldiver, which is something I always enjoy, and mission progress constantly unlocks new weapons, gear, and modifications, which keeps things fresh. The 2 things that make Helldivers stand out to me are total vulnerability to friendly fire, which means you really have to coordinate with your teammates, and stratagems. Stratagems are loadout options that have to be activated in real time by long combinations of button presses, which make them tough to deploy under enemy fire. They range from ammo resupplies, barbed wire and stationary turrets, to surveillance drones, airstrikes, 4-man tanks, and armored mech suits with miniguns and homing missiles. That allows for a ton of tactical options, but there's also something immensely satisfying about sprinting away from an enemy with no bullets left, just managing to fire off a stratagem, and turning the tables on your pursuer with a flamethrower. This game also has an overarching online campaign where players make collective progress by pushing back the 3 alien fronts, which I don't care about at all. However, there are definitely too few options for couch co-op these days, and Helldivers is a great time blasting aliens with your friends. And it took me so long to make this video that the sequel, Helldivers 2, has been out for a while. And it's super fun. Same basic concept with better graphics, an over-the-shoulder camera, and online multiplayer. I do sort of miss the couch co-op, but overall Helldivers 2 is a really great experience, and I'm glad it actually hit mainstream popularity. Check out both games if you haven't. Into the Breach. Into the Breach is the second game from Justin Ma and Matthew Davis of Subset Games, the developers behind FTL, and it's a banger. Into the Breach is a tactical roguelike about an elite squad of mech pilots fighting a planet-wide war against giant insectoids called the Vek. I've played a lot of turn-based tactical games, and this one somehow manages to feel both familiar and wildly innovative. Each mission pits your 3 mechs against a swarm of Vek hell-bent on destruction, but the most famous thing about this game is that the enemy's next moves are clearly communicated to the player. You can see exactly how each Vek intends to move, or what building they intend to attack, and that of course informs your moves. Do you throw yourself between an enemy and its target? Shove them into a new line of attack? Which enemy do you prioritize attacking? While you have to clear individual missions to progress the campaign, your overall success depends on protecting the central power grid. Every time Vek blast or smash into buildings, your global health bar takes a hit, and if it ever runs out, your campaign ends. This means you can never get complacent, because even when victory feels inevitable, you still have to guard against collateral damage. It also means you have to balance objectives against protecting the grid. Is it worth it to make an aggressive move that sacrifices a building, or do you deviate from your strategic plan to save the building? Is there a brilliant move that potentially lets you do both? I think my favorite thing about Into the Breach is the compact scale. You only have 3 mechs. Maps are 8x8 grids. Enemies have single-digit health bars, and most missions last only 5 turns. It's just perfectly tuned for tight, exciting levels, with good variety and satisfying positional gameplay. Of course, there's also a million mechs and upgrades to play with, so if you're a fan of the genre, Into the Breach has nearly infinite replayability. Proteus. Maybe you're not exactly the tactical sort, but you still don't feel that aliens deserve to live. And perhaps you also feel that the perfection of 3D graphics was in fact a mistake, and we should have just stopped evolving the technology sometime between Doom and GoldenEye. Well, if so, Proteus is for you. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one, and that's because it's exactly what you'd expect from that description. A grungy throwback first-person shooter about blasting aliens into bloody, pixelated chunks. This one's intense in the best way. Just a red-tinted, metal-fueled rampage with satisfying sound design, non-stop waves of enemy cannon fodder, and no other distractions. There are a few modern touches thrown in, like ADS, a wide range of difficulty settings, and a well-designed HUD, which are all positive additions that improve the experience. Outside the campaign, you can also engage with Proteus's level editor to make your own maps, or play on popular maps from the community, some of which are pretty silly in the best way. Which means, of course, that Proteus also has a multiplayer mode, with tons of options, local, online, competitive, or co-op, so you can play whichever way you prefer. Of course, the best part of Proteus is the guns. My favorites are the Shredders, a pair of dual-wielded submachine guns, the minigun, which tears through enemies like the pixels they are, and the arc rail, which can either chain lightning between tightly grouped enemies or charge up a beam that cuts through multiple enemies. I like when indie creators reimagine games from older eras of gaming, and Proteus is a nostalgic blast from the past. Cryptarch. Cryptarch is a game about infiltrating massive, high-security spaceships and neutralizing their power cores to cash in on government contracts. Like Into the Breach, every game is a roguelike campaign with a series of tactical missions centered on preserving one central resource. Except in this case, that resource isn't a national power grid, it's cold hard cash. You're sort of a space privateer, bounty hunter commando with a limited operations budget. Every successful raid nets a cash bounty, but you have to subtract all the money you choose to spend on gear, weapons, ammunition, armor, and health, and if you ever run out of cash, it's game over. You can save some pennies by attempting missions with lower health, weaker weapons, and limited ammo, or you can break the bank and arm yourself to the teeth with nuke grenades, flamethrowers, and Vulcan lasers. There's no such thing as an overpowered weapon in Cryptarch because the most powerful weapons are also the most expensive. If you overspend, missions will be easier, but you may end up with a net loss even if you succeed. Deciding how much you need and what you can get away with leaving behind is a fun, push-your-luck exercise in planning that feels like a pre-heist movie montage. The levels in Cryptarch are also pretty interesting. Basically, picture taking down an FTL-style ship with different systems that interact with each other in some tricky ways. For instance, factory systems constantly produce hostile drones, and repair systems cause drones to regenerate health. Shield systems surround another ship system with an impenetrable force field, and alarm systems summon waves of enemies if you attack the system they protect. The sensor jammer prevents your minimap from working, and the failsafe system assumes the functionality of any other system you destroy. Some ships are equipped with the chaotic shuffle system, which randomly swaps the positions of all ship systems every 60 seconds. It's up to you to decide what order to tackle these systems in, whether it's worth it to destroy them all systematically or just go straight for the central core. The combination of clever ship defenses and risk-reward preparations make Cryptarch an underrated and highly replayable tactical puzzle. Cryptarch also has a more colorful, fully 3D sequel called Gunhead, which is in the Risk of Rain 2 Helldivers 2 trilogy of 3D sequels to 2D games, which repeat the exact same core mechanics and central ideas. Gunhead has an art style and overall flair that I really like, but I think in this case I ultimately prefer the slightly more tactical 2D gameplay of Cryptarch. I think both games, however, are worth your time. If you want to blast more aliens, infiltrate enemy bases, or pancake cities, here are a few more games to keep on your radar. Brigador, specifically the Up Armored Edition, is about piloting a mech over buildings and obliterating ant-sized soldiers by the hundreds. It's got a really old-school feel and a ton of mechs to play with. Trepang 2, stylized as Trepang Squared, is an ultra-violent first-person shooter about a super soldier, Subject 106, escaping an experimental black site and going on a rampage that features bullet time, flying 2-feet kicks to the face, and a gory kill count that could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool with blood. Invincible Inc. is 5 minutes into the future sci-fi about tactical stealth missions and tech heists. Obviously, you're not doing conventional warfare, but it's the information age, and espionage is the front line. You can upgrade your crew along the way, and the tactical turn-based gameplay feels right at home in this category. Void Bastards is a first-person shooter with a cool, cel-shaded comic book art style about raiding derelict ships and blasting your way through a deadly nebula. Described by the creators as a strategy shooter, Void Bastards combines a roguelike campaign with clever gameplay, interesting weapons and equipment, and some pretty difficult levels. Heat Signature is a top-down pixelated shooter about infiltrating spaceships to assassinate targets, steal stuff, or just hijack the ship, returning each time to a Deadpool-style mercenary bar to buy upgrades and accept more missions. It feels a little bit like Cryptarch meets Hotline Miami, and it's a fun time overall. I guess you could also include Superhot, which is arguably more about simulated reality and brain space, but it does involve extremely clever combat with a sci-fi twist. This is honestly one of the most video gamey genres we've discussed, so I'm sure there's a million other wars to fight and enemies to blow up. Recommend your favorites below. Ghost in the Machine. AI, consciousness, and the self. Since pretty much the dawn of computing, an analogy has been drawn between the human brain and man-made circuitry. While this analogy is imperfect, on a very basic level, it is true that both neurons and CPUs process information through binary signaling, which suggests, at least to the imaginations of sci-fi writers, that the only fundamental differences between digital and biological computing are those of speed, scale, and complexity, differences that may eventually be erased by technological advancement. Anyway, the implications of this comparison have been pushed in two main narrative directions. The first line of thinking asks what, if anything, separates artificial intelligence from quote-unquote real human intelligence. So stories in this subgenre examine the moral and ethical implications of AI, the role of AI in society, and ideas like emergent consciousness or robot rights. This is obviously a hot topic in the real world, where a few of these concerns have proven to be surprisingly prescient. The second line of thinking examines the implications of consciousness being merely a program run on the world's soggiest computer, asking whether it might be possible to upload one's consciousness to a digital environment, to copy and paste consciousness from one being to another, to manually edit brain architecture by altering or deleting memories, or by implanting false ones, to augment brain functionality with cybernetics, or to suspend the human brain in a virtual simulation. The video games in this section have taken these concepts and run with them, and if that intrigues you, you yourself can make like a brain in a vat and plug into these virtual worlds. The Turing Test. AI can write short stories, generate recipes, and produce surreal artwork, but can it solve a long series of puzzles that involve transferring energy between various devices? That is the question that the Turing Test tries to answer. The premise is that you and your AI companion awaken from sleep mode in an orbital craft near Jupiter's moon Europa, and descend to a planetary base to reunite with your space comrades, only to discover that they've been contending with a rogue, divergent version of the same AI, and have reconfigured the base in a way that supposedly can only be navigated through human ingenuity. I guess clicking on images that contain traffic lights doesn't cut it in the future. The result is a labyrinthine complex of puzzle rooms, which, as you'll soon see, is a pretty common trope in this genre. Between puzzle rooms, you'll interact with your AI companion and read logs from the Europa crew, which paint a picture of increasing paranoia and desperation, and lead to honestly a pretty killer ending that I won't spoil. The puzzles themselves mostly revolve around a gun that lets you beam power orbs in and out of various machines. A lot of the puzzles require very precise timing, or positioning, and all require that you understand the devices around you. This is definitely from the Portal school of turning a first-person shooter into a puzzle game, and I gotta say I'm always super impressed by 3D puzzle games. They seem way harder to do well than 2D ones. This is coming from someone who's never designed either one, so take that with a grain of salt, but it just seems really complicated to achieve tight puzzle design in 3D, to take into account all the different angles and make sure your puzzles can't be cheesed or solved in unintended ways, so you don't end up like the square hole girl.
The triangle. We know what hole that goes
The
into,
triangle.
right?
Triangle.
That's right, the square hole.
The puzzles in the Turing Test are tightly designed, and the combination of clever levels with just the right amount of story make the Turing Test a compelling play for lovers of thinky puzzle games. The Talos Principle. The Talos Principle is another game with a massive labyrinth of puzzle areas that act as a proving ground for your intelligence and humanity. You are a nascent android receiving instructions from the disembodied voice of your robot god, which direct you to explore the overgrown landscape and solve puzzles, but not to ascend the central tower. And I think I've heard this one before, but I don't remember Adam and Eve having to solve quite so many laser puzzles. I mean, some, obviously. This game is chock full of allusions to mythology and religion, from your virtual Garden of Eden to the title itself, which is a reference to an ancient Greek automaton created by the gods. Some of the puzzles here are deviously clever, involving lasers, drones, force fields, jamming devices, and other gadgets that you can strategically position. And the game is more or less open world, allowing you to tackle puzzles or roam around the environment as you see fit. You can also access various computer terminals to read logs and emails from the scientists who created this world. And if you're the sort of person who enjoys reading philosophical musings on the nature of consciousness, the self, and the downfall of humanity, you'll be in heaven. See, I can make biblical references too. I myself could take or leave these interludes, but they are well crafted. The Talos Principle also does the thing I love, where some hidden bonus puzzles involve tricky relationships between different puzzle areas. Like, not to be spoilerific, but maybe a laser in one puzzle could be placed on a high ledge where it would interact all the way across the map with a laser in a totally different puzzle. I don't know. Once you discover even one of these bonus puzzles, it opens your mind to the game in a whole new way, and has you checking every angle for sneaky hidden puzzles. This is a really big game, and there's enough here to keep you engaged, solving puzzles, and questioning your humanity. From your initial robot genesis through all your eventual revelations. Boom, did it again. There's also a sequel that I haven't played, but I suspect is more of the same, which isn't a knock. This is one of the best designed and most difficult puzzle games around, so if you're clamoring for more, the second coming may be even better than the first. Crosscode. Crosscode is an epic action RPG from the same Matrix-adjacent genre as Ready Player One, Sword Art Online, and Spy Kids 3D, Game Over. In other words, it's set within an in-universe video game. In this case, a simulated MMORPG called Crossworlds. Crossworlds is a JRPG-style action-adventure with a leveling system and Zelda-inspired dungeons. Pretty good dungeons, actually, populated by avatars of fictional players from all over the world. Your character is an avatar with no memories and a broken speech module, playing crossworlds in an attempt to regain her memories. And Crosscode does a lot of fun things with the whole game within a game concept. You'll encounter PvP duels, in-universe glitches, and talk about versions and patches and updates. One of the ways the game gives hints is by showing other Crossworlds players attempting certain bits of platforming, or talking about how they completed various quest lines. Your in-game party members will occasionally log off to do things in their real lives, and some quest areas are instanced, forcing you to go it alone. This is an interesting one for a list about sci-fi games, because it is mostly set in a fantasy world with swords and elemental magic and guilds, but rest assured, the sci-fi elements are a lot more than a jumping off point or a framing narrative, and Crosscode does more than enough to land itself in this very section of the list. It's hard to say more without venturing into spoiler territory, but the sci-fi diehards among you will not be disappointed, and Crosscode explores a lot of intriguing consequences of existing in a video game world. There's also behind-the-scenes intrigue around the employees of Instatainment, the company that created Crossworlds. I will say Crosscode is a bit long and grindy for my taste, so if you're not on board for a Zelda-length adventure with puzzly dungeons and side quests and leveling, play something else. But if that's your jam, I think Crosscode works as both a tribute to 90s JRPGs and as a grander meta-narrative about simulated reality, brain architecture, and personhood. Cogmind. Cogmind is one of those games that's been in early access for the better part of a decade, and I've checked back in with it a number of times over that period. Much like the game itself, the mechanical protagonist of Cogmind is in a state of perpetual development. You are a robot, cobbling yourself together from the cast-off parts and salvage of other, less fortunate droids in a vast and often hostile machine world. Acquiring new parts and modules is how you customize your character and specialize your skills, but it's important to stay flexible, as you're just as likely to lose parts to combat or general degradation. Just a real ship of Theseus, winding your way through roguelike levels and harvesting legs, wheels, or treads, cannons and lasers and engines and more from a huge variety of enemy types. There is a story here with some interesting background lore, and the Cogmind itself has a unique place in the story that drives the late game. Cogmind has a really cool aesthetic that blends an old-school ASCII interface with modern particle effects and sound design. It also has a really expansive interface, which is important, because I think the best way to enjoy this game is by deep diving into the relationship between different parts and crafting a fun build. This type of game can be a bit opaque, but Cogmind also provides a lot of tools to get you started and make gameplay as intuitive as possible. I've played a fair amount of Cogmind, but this is another one that feels just absolutely massive in scope. I'll probably revisit Cogmind in the future, and if you're intrigued by an old-school roguelike with a unique sci-fi bent, you should too. For more indies about AI and consciousness, check out Thomas Was Alone, a minimalist puzzle platformer about rectangular AIs becoming self-aware and developing emergent personalities as they hop around the screen. It's cute and heartwarming and features some tricky platforming challenges. Or Superliminal, a trippy perspective-based puzzle game about dream therapy that sees you bend and distort reality like the cast of Inception. Some extremely clever puzzle rooms and a memorable narrative there. State of Mind is a story-forward game about a guy whose life gets turned upside down after a traumatic accident. It delves into some cool concepts like digitally split personalities, and has a really cool angular art style. And of course, one of my faves, To the Moon, which is 5 minutes into the future sci-fi about memory-implanting scientists who fix end-of-life regrets, and the resulting trip into the consciousness of a man on his deathbed. That one's a tearjerker with some clever uses of memories and other brain architecture. And if you yourself are a sentient android, or perhaps a cloud-based AI, first of all, let us all know what that's like, and second, feel free to recommend some more games about your culture. Gadgets: technology, innovation, and industry. Isaac Asimov described 3 broad categories of science fiction, which he called gadget, adventure, and social. Gadget stories are stories about the invention of some speculative technology beyond our current capabilities. Adventure stories are about adventures undertaken with said technology. Think Star Trek or space adventure games like FTL and Outer Wilds. Social stories examine the far-reaching effects of technological advancements on society, humanity, class relationships, and human governance, like the entire cyberpunk genre and specifically games like Citizen Sleeper or Valhalla. The games in this section are of the gadget variety, which means you get to embrace your inner engineer. Interestingly, the gadget was also the nickname of the first atomic bomb detonated during the Trinity test. A fitting comparison, as new technology in science fiction often marks a revolutionary shift in the way the world works. In the same way modern humans might divide the world into the eras before and after nuclear weapons, spaceflight, or the internet, science fiction imagines worlds pre- and post-interstellar colonization, faster-than-light travel, artificial intelligence, or transhuman cybernetics. so stories about the inception of those technologies are a natural cornerstone of the genre. Often more science than fiction, the games in this category tend to be intricate, in-depth, and unforgiving, requiring you to really get to grips with the material. They're often best played on PC, thanks to expansive interfaces, lengthy tutorials, and in-game wikis, but if you invest the time and energy, it can be incredibly satisfying to engineer, optimize, and program complex systems. Kerbal Space Program. More than most on this list, Kerbal Space Program puts the emphasis squarely on the science rather than the fiction. Kerbal Space Program is set on the planet Kerbin, which is populated by green, bug-eyed humanoids called Kerbals, some of whom, like Gene Kerman and Werner von Kerman, run the aptly named Kerbal Space Program. The Kerbals and their gibberish language are a huge part of the charm of KSP, but as silly as these Kerbonauts can be, this game is not messing around. The moment I first knew I was in for a real Newtonian physics romp was the moment the game explained to me that a fuel tank's center of mass would shift as the fuel inside was expended, and that this would have to be taken into account when calculating thrust or performing other maneuvers. Obviously, this makes total sense because that's how physics and mass work in real life, but it's the kind of thing you don't expect to be modeled by video game physics. Kerbal Space Program models an awful lot of real physics, which allows you to perform maneuvers like gravity slingshots, and cause atmospheric effects like drag and aerodynamic heating. The Kerbal solar system is a cartoonish version of our solar system, and can be explored either in sandbox mode, or in science or career mode, which add research and the business side of running a space agency, respectively. Either way, players attempt to accomplish milestones from the space race and beyond, like safely leaving and re-entering the atmosphere, establishing stable orbit, or landing on the moon. KSP gives you massive creative freedom over your spacecraft design, which inevitably leads to a lot of trial and error, emphasis on the error. Catastrophic failure is a regular occurrence, and you will likely sacrifice a lot of Kerbals in the name of scientific discovery.
Many Kerbals died to bring us this information.
However, with much perseverance, and for the good of the planet Kerbin, you can eventually complete such far-flung objectives as launching a space station, landing unmanned rovers on distant planets, and leaving the solar system altogether. Spacechem. Spacechem is a game about programming reactors to receive one or more input molecules, and then churn out different output molecules. And I don't know how to make that sound any more intriguing or interesting, but trust me when I say that this game is amazing. At a glance, Spacechem looks a lot like edutainment, and I guess it sort of is, since you get to grips with the logic of a sort of visual programming language, but I think that's massively underselling the experience. Spacechem is probably my favorite of the incredibly thinky games put out by Zachtronics, all of which are pretty great. Every reactor in the game consists of an 8x10 grid, onto which you draw pathways and place commands that order two color-coded grabbers to pick up, drop, rotate, connect, disconnect, or output various molecules. You'll soon discover that this is a very restrictive amount of space that demands extremely creative problem solving. You'll often patch a problem with your design, only to realize that your fix has unintended consequences for the rest of the solution. Yeah, it would be nice to place a rotation instruction here, but when the path winds back over itself, it rotates something else that shouldn't be rotated, and now you're straight back to the drawing board. To make matters more complicated, some levels in Spacechem feature multiple reactors to place and connect, which adds more layers to think about, like timing between reactors and syncing up the output rates of your whole production line. Some of the puzzles feel truly impossible at a glance, in a way that makes me feel like the NASA engineers in Apollo 13 who have to come up with a way for Tom Hanks to plug a square ventilator into a round hole. In a few frustrating dead ends, my inner monologue was essentially screaming at me,
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave! With a box of scraps!
But you know, that just makes it all the more satisfying when you do eventually find a solution. And that makes Spacechem one of the most rewarding games I've played. Plus, it's really satisfying to watch your solutions play back at high speeds. As an aside, I've listened to a lot of these soundtracks while making this video, and this is the one I've come back to the most. It's very good, and the perfect background for making videos, programming nuclear reactors, or just vibing. Factorio. Factorio is a massive industrial-scale engine builder, and probably the most well-known game in this category. Factorio is a game that I was obviously aware of for a long time, but hadn't actually played, because I suspected, rightly, that it would be a huge time commitment. That being the case, I was previously under a few minor misconceptions about the game. First, I was under the impression that Factorio was played from a zoomed-out, omniscient third-person camera perspective, like Civilization or The Sims. But in fact, you control a lone engineer who can shoot at aliens, mine resources manually, and construct buildings on the map. I was also under the impression that Factorio was just about scaling up your planet-wide industry for its own sake. But that's not the case. The actual goal of Factorio, or at least a standard game of Factorio, is to scale your factory to an absolutely massive scale and progress through the tech tree until you can build a rocket and escape the planet. It's hard to overstate the enormity of that undertaking. Resources that you initially mine with a pickaxe will eventually be needed by the millions, and your factory's footprint will eventually dwarf the starting map. A couple hours into your first game of Factorio, you'll realize how janky and poorly planned your factory is and feel the urge to restart with your current knowledge. And that pattern will pretty much repeat at each new stage of production. Each new tier of production dwarfs the previous by comparison. Think it was hard to manufacture your first electronic circuits or plastic bars? Now you need 50,000. That's the heart of Factorio. Planning, powering, and crafting a network of pipes, conveyor belts, inserters, trains, furnaces, and assembling machines capable of continuous exponential expansion. After all, the factory must grow. Meanwhile, unless you elect to play on peaceful mode, your efforts will be continuously hampered by the local alien population, who will raid and destroy your infrastructure at the most inconvenient moments possible. You can invest in defenses like perimeter walls and auto turrets, but a clever twist in Factorio is that the more you pollute the environment with your factories, the more the hostile xenofauna will mutate and evolve into even more obnoxious threats. You can therefore stay as green as possible in an effort to slow enemy mutation, or you can crank production levels to 11 and try to win the arms race against the biters and spitters. Factorio is an addicting and intricately designed game about programming and planning, and whether you've crafted the most perfectly efficient mega factory or struggled through setbacks and cobbled together a spaghetti mess of winding conveyor belts, it's always satisfying to witness a successful rocket launch. Infinifactory. According to this game's own marketing, it is Space Chem in 3D, so it's not a surprise that I liked Infinifactory. The premise of Infinifactory is that you have been abducted by aliens, and are forced to engineer increasingly complex assembly lines of Minecraft-looking alien products in exchange for a daily ration of food pellets, and the occasional carrot of Earth treasures like soccer trophies and workout cassettes. Each level consists of an output node, which requests a certain number of very specifically shaped products, and input nodes, which dispense a steady stream of raw materials. Your job is to construct an assembly line that fulfills the task using an array of blocks that push, rotate, lift, or convey other blocks, weld blocks together, demolish blocks, or cut through them with lasers. This can be extremely difficult, and requires a ton of creativity as there's no one right way to solve a level. Infinifactory has one of my favorite ever Steam reviews, which simply says, "Don't buy it if you are dumb." And honestly, that could describe any of the games I've talked about in this section. But I was not deterred, and I bought all of these games anyway, so you can too. One cool part of Infinifactory that definitely made me feel dumb is the post-level breakdown that compares your performance to other players globally. Once or twice, I hit some really good stats, but for the most part, my haphazard creations were average at best. And I think this highlights two different ways to play the game. The way I played was with a just-make-it-work mindset, rarely rebuilding my suboptimal assembly lines and mainly focused on achieving the level objectives. Because mission progression is entirely pass-fail, this is still a really satisfying way to play and by no means an easy feat. However, I totally see the appeal of taking one level and optimizing every last detail, especially with world records on the line. I think both are satisfying ways to play. I can say I was fully drawn in by Infinifactory's one more level gameplay loop, and it was fun to innovate new strategies for timing assembly lines, constructing bizarre shapes, and utilizing the blocky alien environments. There's so many more games about gadgets and tech and engine building, and I think it's a tough genre to fully explore because of how big and complex these games can be. I also think the average person who really enjoys this genre is more likely to pour hundreds or thousands of hours into a single title like Factorio than to sample lots of different engine builders. That said, here's a few more games about sci-fi gadgetry. Hard Space Shipbreakers is a game about deconstructing technology rather than constructing it, but you really have to understand the stuff you're breaking down so you don't get crushed, incinerated, or blown up. Oxygen Not Included is an intricate base builder with a cutesy art style, but lots of complexity to keep you engaged. You'll have to work overtime to keep your flimsy colonists alive in this one. Space Engineers is a game I'd like to play more. It's basically Minecraft in space with base building and realistic ship physics. You can get really granular with the design and make some pretty cool stuff. Another game that seems good, but I haven't played enough to really discuss in depth, is Satisfactory, which is another massive factory builder that brings a lot of Factorio's ideas into a first-person 3D game world. If you've played either of those more than I have, which wouldn't be that hard, feel free to rant or rave about them in the comments. For a much, much shorter experience, Gravitas is a Portal-inspired first-person puzzle game about manipulating gravity technology while accompanied by a cheeky, cube-shaped robot. It's a free, fun little game you can beat in under an hour. Also, if you like the programming-style gameplay of Space Chem and Infinifactory, Definitely check out other Zachtronics games like Shenzhen.io and Exapunks, both of which are tricky puzzlers that involve innovative problem solving. Zach Barth really knows how to make a puzzle game. And of course, be sure to recommend your favorite gadget game in the comments, or if you're really inspired by this genre, design your own. After the End. Catastrophe and post-apocalyptic fiction. Perhaps the grimmest sci-fi stories imagine technology not as a weapon, or even a tool of oppression, but as the herald of an extinction event. The games in this genre are about the end of the world, humanity, and life as we know it. Maybe humanity was overthrown by an AI revolution, let the thermonuclear genie out of the bottle, lost World War III, or triggered an ecological catastrophe. Maybe it's not clear what happened. Whatever the case, humanity has slammed headlong into the Great Filter, and civilization is no mas. Whatever society remains is either a depressed shell of its former self or a bleak survivalist war of all against all. Forgotten technologies are either viewed with fear or revered as magical relics. The protagonists of these games are cynical, hardened, and isolated. A common story thread in this genre is the attempt to accomplish one last meaningful quest in the face of true meaninglessness, a real rager against the dying of the light. Through hints, wreckage, reminiscences, or investigation, you'll likely learn more about humanity's fate in the process. Some of the more hopeful games in this genre approach the apocalypse with humor, or extol the virtue of human perseverance. But more often than not, hopelessness is the point, because the ultimate theme of the post-apocalyptic genre is the inevitability of death and decay. And with that cheery description, let's dive into the post-apocalypse. Caves of Qud. Caves of Qud is a sprawling, early-access, post-apocalyptic roguelike RPG about... well, it would probably be faster to list what this game isn't about. Caves is set in a crapsack, barren world where pretty much everything is trying to kill you. From mutant scavengers and cannibals, to crocodiles, robots, aggressive plants, Knights Templar, apes, disease, and, above all, thirst. Purified water is both the game's currency and an important consideration when adventuring or attempting to cross the Great Salt Desert. It's true that this game can be a bit unintuitive, but if you invest the time, there's a tactical turn-based combat system with loads of skills to explore, a million factions to befriend or antagonize, and a chaotic character creator that lets you build some truly bonkers protagonists. In my first game, I was a mutant telepath with a staff that shot lasers and a feral attack dog I psychically charmed to my side. In my second attempt, I was a gunslinger with wings and precognition and an evil twin who occasionally turned up and eventually shot me dead. I've since had many more successful adventures with equally wacky characters, delving into obscure lore and doing the water ritual with many an NPC. Speaking of lore, this is also a game for language lovers. If your joy is sparked by phrases like rebuking robots, ponying up a dram of water, or a guttural boom in the contrabass spectrum drumming out of a vocal sack, then you will get the most out of this game. If not, I guess you won't like it very much. But if you're up for a thinky, difficult, text-heavy game with endless off-the-wall possibilities and tons of emergent narrative, check this out. Stray. They say if you die alone in your apartment, your cat will eventually eat you. I'm not saying that for sure happened en masse in the world of Stray, but there are no more humans and cats are still around, so you do the math. Stray follows an orange tabby cat who becomes trapped in Walled City 99, a quarantined cyberpunk city populated exclusively by robots, and embarks on a quest to reach the outside world with his robot drone companion, B12. This could just as easily fit into the cyberpunk or AI genres, but the most interesting and mysterious aspect of Stray is exploring a post-human world. It's implied that the remnants of humanity were long ago eliminated by some kind of plague, and the robots of Stray live in the shell of the human city, living simple lives and carrying out mundane tasks like cleaning, repairs, and knitting. Of course, the best and most memorable part of this game is playing as a cat, which means you can leap nimbly from point to point, crawl under furniture, and scratch carpets with no humans around to tell you off. There's something haunting and a bit creepy about seeing human environments through non-human eyes, and Stray makes the best of this dynamic to tell a melancholy story about human creations outlasting their creators. A cat protagonist is just a really creative and unique way to frame a story about the aftermath of humanity. I was a bit down on the gameplay of Stray when I talked about last year's Game Awards, and I stand by everything I said then, but I do still respect the premise and the world of Stray. Despite some tedium and a few clunky segments, there's mystery, adventure, some horror light, beautiful environments and fun references, and ultimately a very compelling ending that left me with appreciation for the experience. Golf Club Wasteland. This is just a little game about playing a round of golf in the abandoned urban ruins of planet Earth. The premise of this game is that most of humanity has been wiped out by an ecological catastrophe, but the ultra-rich have fled to a colony on Mars, from which they occasionally return to perfect their short game in a hollowed-out mega-metropolis. You play as a disaffected space pilot who, feeling out of place in the new colony, returns to Earth to play one final round of golf before dying. So that's what you do in this game. Drive a ball through skyscrapers and shopping malls and construction sites while tuning into a surreal, long-range radio program entitled Radio Nostalgia from Mars. This is actually the main selling point of the game, a background album that mixes retro-futuristic synthwave and techno tracks with mellow commentary about the downfall of Earth and colonial life on Mars, punctuated by occasional callers who reminisce about the before times. I'll be honest, the golf mechanics in Golf Club Wasteland are nothing to write home about, and some of the messaging is pretty on the nose. At one point, you putt past bitcoins covered in toxic sludge. But the absurd premise is what carries this game and makes for a surprisingly chill experience. And I'm guessing you knew just from the premise whether this is the kind of experience you vibe with or not. Hyperlight Drifter. Hyperlight Drifter imagines a vague future in which advanced technology lies buried and forgotten. Decaying husks of giant mechanical titans serve as mountainous landmarks, and the remnants of society gather in small villages bartering supplies for worn-out gear bits. The protagonist, a drifter with a gun, an energy sword, and a terminal illness, wanders the overgrown landscape, killing mutant enemies and scavenging abandoned facilities for parts and answers. The storytelling in Hyperlight Drifter is deliberately opaque and open to interpretation, relying on occasional still images and hints from the environment. And this game does atmosphere really well, from cryptic game areas and imagery to a haunting and gloomy soundscape. But the best games of this kind marry memorable atmosphere and storytelling to great gameplay, and Hyperlight Drifter features incredibly sharp, satisfying combat, with a steep difficulty curve and bombastic boss fights. I really like this game, and while it's fairly light on sci-fi elements, there's enough there to imagine a fallen future of fantastical titans and long-forgotten tech, and the rarity of advanced weaponry imbues it with a quasi-mythical quality. I like the post-apocalyptic juxtaposition of wielding laser weapons in an overgrown jungle, and it's just fun to roam around killing monsters and collecting upgrades. This is a classic in my book, and well worth a play. If you're looking to spend more time at the end of the world, Far-Flung is a very good game about forcing a colossal, ramshackle vehicle across a dusty ruinscape, but I didn't include it because it leans a bit more steampunk than sci-fi. Kenshi is a crazy, sprawling RPG set in a post-apocalyptic open world with destructible limbs and warring factions and much more that I've messed with but haven't fully sunk my teeth into. Nuclear Throne is a classic bullet hell roguelike with a ton of weapons, mutations, and chaotic top-down violence. Not exactly story-heavy, but you can sink a ton of hours into the shoot-'em-up gameplay and it gives off some of that Mad Max energy. Primordia is a clever point-and-click adventure about robot companions navigating a post-human world and confronting some of humanity's ghosts. It also explores a robot religion where, naturally, humans are the creators. RimWorld is a survival exploration game about a mutant slug cat foraging for food, fending off predators, and roaming the ruins of a technologically advanced society. The movement in RimWorld is fluid and gorgeous, if a little unintuitive, but I like the vibes of the slug cat traversing the ruined world, and this game also has a very passionate fan base. At this point, I think there's enough games to keep you entertained until the world actually ends, but just in case, recommend some post-apocalyptic indies I missed. Science fiction is a genre that will never go out of style. There's an incredible tradition to draw from, but also endless futures and possibilities to imagine, and it's really cool to see video games contribute to that legacy. Maybe one day games like Inside or Outer Wilds, or others yet to be dreamt up, will be mentioned with the same reverence as Doom or The Matrix or Blade Runner. But whether it's high art or mindless entertainment, or anywhere in between, I had a ton of fun playing through the games on this list, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I actually mentioned over 100 games in this video, so if you have any interest in sci-fi, I'm sure there's something here that appeals to you. Which of these have you played? And which games are you intrigued to check out? What are some games I missed? As always, be sure to like or share this video and subscribe to the channel so it can keep growing. There will be another big video coming before too terribly long, so check back soon, and I'll see you all in the future.